1955. The Second Hundred Years' War is in full swing. The British Army has had no success in the war for the last 10 years. In the center of the Arctic Circle, far from the front line, there is an outpost that has been intercepting enemy radio messages for 10 years. Also, prohibited scientific experiments are being conducted at the outpost to speed up victory in the war. Morning at Outpost 11. A young soldier named Albert gets to work. He puts on headphones and listens to the radio interference. Soon he receives a radio message consisting of numbers. He enters them into the computer and sits down at the table again. Meanwhile, an officer named Mason is on the hunt. He has tracked the hare and is going to shoot it. Mason approaches the dead hare to pick it up, but the hare was mined. The man is thrown back by the blast wave and loses consciousness. Meanwhile, at the outpost, Albert continues to listen to radio interference and at some point hears a strange sound. He's going to write down a new message on a piece of paper, but the headphones produce a loud beep. A red lamp lights up at the outpost. Albert doesn't know what to do and presses a special button to wake up the radio operator who works at night. Graham wakes up from a sudden noise. The man takes out the shell casing and sniffs it. Then he reaches into his pants with his hand. During the process, he notices a spider on the wall and immediately kills it. He hates spiders. Graham leaves the room and immediately begins to scold Albert for the wrong military salute. He says that discipline is the only thing that distinguishes people from animals. Albert says there is a problem. He points to the flashing lamp. Graham examines the lamp and says that it should not blink. He explains that when enemies attack, a lamp lights up and an audible alarm sounds, but there is no sound signal. Graham comes to the conclusion that this is an electrical fault. He asks where Mason is. Albert says that he went hunting. Graham thinks that Mason spends a lot of time on all sorts of nonsense instead of work. Albert says that they don't have much work. Hearing these words, Graham begins to get very angry and says that they are carrying out an important mission, and even the king is relying on them. Graham is very patriotic and does not tolerate people like Albert. The man decides to teach the young soldier a lesson. He sends him to the engine room. Graham knows that Albert is claustrophobic. Albert goes to the engine room and begins inspecting the reactor. Meanwhile, Mason returns from hunting. Graham points a gun at him, thinking he is the enemy. Then he sees that it is Mason and puts the gun to his head. He utters a strange phrase and waits for an answer from Mason. The officer says he shouldn't take it so seriously, but Graham continues to hold the gun to his temple. Mason says a response, and Graham puts the weapon away. Graham says he does everything according to the instructions. Mason says that they tried to kill him while hunting. He doesn't understand why the enemies used a mine instead of a regular weapon. Graham says that during his absence a red light came on, but without a sound signal. Mason says he will check everything himself. He meets Albert and says that he can go cook the hare. Meanwhile, Graham notices a strange blister on his hand and goes to his room. That evening at dinner, Graham eats the whole hare and does not leave a single piece for Albert. At night, Mason asks Graham why he is so strict with Albert. Graham replies that Albert does not look like a soldier. He is too weak and a disgrace to the honor of his uniform. Mason says that Albert did not choose to become a soldier and is still very young. Mason gives the order and forbids Graham to insult Albert. At night, Albert has a terrible dream. He dreams of a reactor. Mason asks what he saw. Albert says he saw God. Graham listens to radio interference all night, but at one moment he hears a loud sound and sees that the red lamp is flashing again. The next morning, Albert starts work, but soon he hears the message. They tell him a secret code and the connection is cut off. Albert will be Graham again. The old man leaves the room very angry. He asks why the hell he wakes him up again and throws a shoe at Albert for not buttoning his uniform. Albert says he received a message. Graham is happy about this news, but still calls Albert names. Graham continues to grumble and opens the safe. He takes out a tape and a folder with important documents and begins to decipher the message. Mason returns from hunting and says that there is no catch today. Graham says that they received the message and is already beginning to decipher it. Mason is happy about this news. He hopes that their mission is coming to an end. Graham deciphers the message. God has forsaken us. Abandon all hope. But Graham decides not to say anything to the others. He hides the piece of paper and writes another phrase. God is with us. Await further instructions. Meanwhile, Mason notices a problem in the reactor. He finds a squid in one of the pipes. Graham reveals that he deciphered the message. Mason is angry when he learns that their mission at the outpost continues. He says that they have been sitting here for 5 years and doing nothing. Graham says they must follow orders. Mason asks him if he knows what they are working on here. And does he remember what he did before he got here? Graham tries to remember but can't. That night, the reactor begins to glow red. The light starts flashing again. Graham's blister becomes too big, and he decides to cut it. He leaves a strange lump on the table. Mason finds the real message and finds out that Graham deceived them. They understand that Graham has gone crazy and cannot be trusted. Mason feels a headache every day. They want to find out what this message means, but to do this, they need to take the keys from Graham. In the morning, Mason asks to give the keys so that he can write a report later. Graham goes to bed, and Mason and Albert open the safe and see that the first part of the message means that they need to proceed with plan number 9. They take the desired tape and turn on the video guide. Meanwhile, Graham sniffs the shell casing, begins to cry, and puts his hand down his pants. On the video, the general says that if they received orders to start plan 9, it means that the war is almost lost. Their task is to destroy the results of secret research that they have been conducting for 5 years. They should stop doing scientific experiments. The general says that the enemy can use different weapons against them, and even secret weapons of recent years. Mason goes outside and follows the order. Now there is no point for them to do the work, because their outpost is secret and no one will come for them. At night, Graham sniffs the shell casing and puts his hand down his pants. Towards the end, he starts screaming and swearing. Albert, lying on top, hears all this. Meanwhile, Mason is thinking about death. In the morning, Mason leaves to find his friend and find out what to do next. Albert says he's afraid to be alone with Graham. He says that the old man broke the computer so that they could not contact anyone. Soon, Albert notices a huge spider. He kills him and goes to bed. In the morning, Graham sits at his workplace. He orders Albert to start cleaning. After some time, the red lamp lights up again. Graham feels like someone is talking to him. He hears a man's voice in his headphones. They tell him that there is a secret mission for him. He must kill Albert because he has defected to the Spider Alliance. The enemies have teamed up with the spiders, and now Graham is the country's last hope. The evening before dinner, Graham examines his hand. The lump lying on the table became larger. Albert serves fried spider. Graham begins to repeat the same phrase. "You know that I don't like spiders." He tears off the spider's leg and eats it. Suddenly, he knocks over the table and shoots the spider. In the morning, Mason notices a man in the distance, but this man has been dead for a long time. Albert can't sleep because of the loud sound. Graham wakes him up and orders him to take the rifle. He says they are being attacked. A lot of time passes, and Albert is offered a little rest. Graham starts swearing and calls Albert a traitor. He locks him in the engine room and turns the reactor on at full power. Then he boards up all the windows and doors and starts hunting spiders. Albert connects all the necessary tubes and instruments to make the reactor work. He turns it on and hears a loud sound. Graham approaches the table and sees that his lump has become a large cocoon. A spider emerges from its cocoon, and Graham hits it with a hammer. Albert notices that the reactor is not working properly. He yanks the phone out. The chemical gets on his face. Mason arrives at another outpost and sees dead people. He reads his friend's notes. He writes that when the lamp started flashing, they received a message. The message said that psychotropic weapons were used on them. One of the military began to hunt saboteurs' hares. Another began to see the devil and ate his own hand. The last entry is that this weapon drove them crazy. Meanwhile, Graham finds Albert screaming in pain. Graham says he went blind due to his stupidity. He drags him along with him. Graham administers first aid to Albert and puts blindfolds on his eyes. He sits him down at the table and makes him listen to radio interference. The phone rings. The spiders invite Graham to surrender. He looks out the window and sees a huge spider. He says that he is not afraid and takes the weapon. Graham goes outside to fight the spiders. Albert comes to his senses. He frees himself from the ropes and takes up a weapon to defend himself. He hears the door open and shoots. but it was Mason. Mason says that the core needs to be disabled to end this madness, but Albert starts crying because of what he did. Mason says that he forgives him and asks him to do what he said. Mason takes the gun and sees Graham. He tells him that they are under the influence of psychotronic weapons, but it's not Graham. Mason shoots himself in the head. Albert disables the core. Graham does not have time to stop him. The core begins to heat up and explodes, thereby ending this strange film. Write your opinion about this in the comments. Like the video, subscribe to the channel, and click on the bell to be the first to watch new videos.